Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is our sixth episode on this series of reigniting the fragments of the fourth way. And below you will see the playlist with the previous other 5 episodes. We are building on each other, so we highly recommend you watch the other ones. And also below here you will see the playlist to one of my practical playlists called Toolbox of Practices, which contain kind of practical exercises and alarm clocks inspired by the fourth way to help assist this work in a practical experiential way. And also you will have access to Peter's website that contains several wonderful, highly recommended books meant to help someone trying to become more conscious, wake up, diminish suffering using the fourth way teaching as well as non-duality teachings, Advaita Vedanta. Yeah, and we are going to go straight into it. So in the fourth way, although there's a lot of lofty, highly intellectual and abstract and condense intellectual information about the nature of our psychology, the nature of how the body-mind works, how the machine works, and how it is actually like a factory that it could use the raw material coming in order to produce higher potential of consciousness. So it's a transmuting factory, and there's a lot of deep and lots of information about the nature of the universe and the cosmology. There's a big part of cosmology in the fourth way, as well as a big part connected to the psychology. At the same time, all of this is geared towards practical application so that we become aware personally in our own personal small life of our false personality and find ways to become more aware of it and in a certain skillful manner to diminish its power in our life. There are practical exercises and teachings, and all of this lofty information is actually meant to somehow jumpstart our essence so it becomes more active. Also, self-consciousness grows, and there's more knowledge of our machine, knowledge of our masks, knowledge about our true innate tendencies. So there is this very important teaching early on in the fourth way is that, well, what shall we do practically? Well, what to do practically is to be equipped and learn a little bit about self-observation and self-remembering and harnessing attention. And with these tools to observe our experience, observe our state of sleep. One way to become more awake is to observe our state of sleep. So in the fourth way, there is this idea that we encouraged early on to start working with the so-called obstacles in the way of self-remembering, obstacles towards self-consciousness. That's a term from the fourth way. And so right away, we can start doing something, you know. We don't need to wait for a special glimpse or a special revelation or a special time. We can already, with self-remembering, self-observation, and focused attention, to tackle what was called the wall of mechanicality or the wall of sleep, the second state. And these obstacles are basically, all of them are areas of work, area of inner work, inner investigation. Those obstacles are the way they were presented by Ouspensky. There were like 6 obstacles. One of them is the so-called imagination, or in other terms, daydreaming, this state of being lost, past or future. veiled in constant random voices and thoughts, worries, rehashing the past, imagining the future, all the time, this constant state of being checked out somewhere else in the radio, ever perpetual radio of the head, this state of being lost in thoughts all the time, identified in the eyes, in the many eyes. This is imagination. The second obstacle is identification, which is a tricky one to explain because we are kind of identified all the time. So one needs to experience some moments of, have a taste of how it is to be not identified, to understand what identification is. So it's a little tricky. It's a little bit like trying to help a fish become aware of the water. So, but identification is an obstacle and an area of the work in the fourth way. And this is state of where that which is aware, our conscious presence, which usually it's in a dormant, pulsating at a low frequency. This presence is sucked into objects, is sucked into a thought. So basically, I'm totally lost into a thought, into an attitude, into a positionality, into a person, into a relationship, into an emotion, into anything. So the state of self-forgetfulness and being lost, seemingly lost somewhere else, out there or in there, with no self-awareness of oneself. The third obstacle is the expression of negative emotions. Negative emotions is a particular term in the fourth way, which is it means more than simply sadness or irritation. It's a whole negative emotions. It's a mechanism where from a certain stimulus or certain stimulus in the moment, there are certain energies that are being stirred within us. They get we identify with them. Then there's some embroidery of negative imagination and taking things personally. And now we are personally offended or triggered as a personal ego. And then we feel very unpleasant and squirmy. And there's this almost unstoppable tendency to blow out, to release that discomfort of our own negative emotions that we churned ourselves, and then we feel justified and entitled and feel normal to kind of express them, and then we feel better. That's the expression of negative emotions. And in the fourth way, this is like the easiest thing to do, basically. And the idea is it's not about repressing them or suppressing them. It's about to use that energy of that emotion or of that trigger to become more aware. And instead of expressing it, we are just deeply conscious to the thoughts and the feelings, the sensation, the interpretations connected with that, and using that to be more aware, remembering oneself more, and use that pressure, the charge of that unpleasantness, that resistance, use that charge to surf it, to feed our, let's say, higher emotional center or our effort of being consciously present. So that's the third obstacle. We are just going to talk very briefly about them now, and then we are going to go into more details. Would you take it from here, Peter, make it more equal? Let's say, the other three obstacles.
Well, there are only two more that I can think of. One is unnecessary talk. This is a less severe obstacle, but it's a tendency for us to talk when we don't really need to be talking. And if you think about that, we don't really need to be talking a lot of the time, but we fill the space with talk because we feel a discomfort when we're with other people. We feel a discomfort to leave those moments of awkward silence. And this is us not, instead of just being present internally when those moments come and being quiet, we feel an impulse coming from our personality that we must project something. We must appear a certain way. We must appear to know what we're talking about or what other people are saying. We must appear to have the last word or to have a definitive point of view. Or sometimes we feel we need to entertain. So we just talk, we ramble.
Hmm.
Another form this takes is when we are speaking, instead of, for example, I might say, today is the day, and then pause, and then go on to say something else. But instead I say, today is the day. And, like, well, and tomorrow is tomorrow. And, and then the day after that, we fill every little space with talk instead of with presence. And then we forget that presence is potentially always behind us. It's always behind the talk. We lose sight of that and we become this talking person. The other obstacle is called lying. This is a broad topic. We were talking about this before we started this video, in fact, that lying can take the simple form of saying things you don't really know. For example, that you really know what's happening with a military conflict somewhere else in the world, and you think you know all about it. You got all the information because you've heard, and now you've got an opinion and you think you're right, and you can spew lots of data about that and hold a firm position, but in fact you're lying because you don't know. You don't really know much at all about what goes on behind the scenes and things like that. And that's just one example. There are many examples. We talk about other people and we don't really know them and what's behind their actions or their behavior. And if we really knew, we would have a different perspective and we wouldn't feel so inclined to make something up. Instead of just acknowledging I don't know, we feel I must now make up, so I must lie. The other side of lying is when we lie to ourselves. And the biggest way we lie to ourselves is in believing that our soul, our true being, is the person sitting in the chair talking, living this life. This is actually a big lie, meaning it's a falsehood, it's a deception, it's a delusion from the perspective of consciousness. It's hard to understand, initially anyway, that you are consciousness, this ineffable, impalpable something that can be present. It's not physical, it's not mental, it's not psychological. It's not a thought or emotion or a sensation or a gesture. And we unwittingly lie to ourselves, and it's an innocent lie, because unless consciousness knows itself as consciousness, the natural propensity is to think, well, I am what I am most identified with, most close to, and that's this being this person. So this is a broad subject, and all of these obstacles, so-called, are really the result of consciousness becoming identified with something. If we were not identified, meaning if consciousness was not identified, the mind might still produce random thoughts, which in the fourth way we call imagination. But if we were not identified, we would recognize it as just that, like a stream, a current in the stream flowing by. We wouldn't jump in after it. We wouldn't swim with it. We wouldn't argue with it. We would just remain on the shore and see the shore of presence, and we would see it go by. It becomes what the fourth way calls imagination, when we start imagining ourselves to be those thoughts. And then, for example, a thought will pop by, will swim by, relative to a conversation we had earlier this morning with someone. Now in our mind, we want to dispute them. And so we jump into the stream, and these are just our own thoughts. It's not the other, it's only our own thoughts. Mihai mentioned in one of our previous videos about taking your mother-in-law to mental court. which I thought was very funny, but it's so true. We then are taking someone to court in our own mind, and we go way downstream and lose ourselves. This is imagination. And then there are different ways we imagine ourselves. But all these obstacles are consciousness losing itself in some fashion. And then we become identified with imagination. The inner considering, maybe we didn't mention that, is this form of identification with other people. And we become identified with other people, how they see us, how we think they see us. And it gets very complicated emotionally, how we place requirements, we impose requirements on each other and on ourselves related to other people. And this is all inner considering. But if we weren't identified, if we were simply conscious and we just manifested from our simple selves, what is called essence in the fourth way, we would have no need we would not position ourselves in relation to other people. We wouldn't have a sense of identity established in ourselves in relation to and dependent upon other people. We would just be ourselves. The same with unnecessary talk and with lying and with negative emotions. All of these are a result of identification. If we weren't identified, then none of these things could take full form. If they started, they would immediately be dispelled, because they'd have no connective psychological tissue, you might say. There'd be no identification there holding them up. It would be like a scarecrow and just not able to gather enough straw to stand up. Anyway, we're going to take each of these separately, as Mihai was saying, and discuss each one. We just want to give a quick overview, kind of a quick taste. What are these obstacles? What does that mean? It means if you try to remember yourself and be present as often as possible, you will find yourself away from that. You will realize you forgot yourself. And it will be in one of these forms, inevitably. You've either become too identified with something, you're lost in imagination, you're inner considering with the people you're around, you're lying in some way, you're talking far more than you need to, and or you're expressing negative emotions. We're going to keep negative emotions later as a separate whole module, because really negative emotions is almost a combination of the other obstacles rolled into one. We're identified, we're having negative imagination about something, we're really lying to ourselves about what causes negativity, and we are it's all, you could say expressing negative emotions is unnecessary talk taken to the hilt. And we'll talk about why the fourth way puts so much emphasis on this in terms of what kind of energy is lost when we express the negative emotion.
And we are going to talk there also, like, because it's a very tricky subject. The non-expression doesn't mean to suppress or repress. And and also there's this element that, although it's talked very little in the fourth way, that there's an emotion that is suppressed or repressed becomes poisonous. So they mention about that, and they discourage repression. We can touch upon also to see how actually there are two different aspects. That's important aspect of self-work to be able to not be hijacked by these negative emotions and to be taken in and being like losing energy into that. That's really crucial. And also it's important on the other angle to not stifle our own, emotions like sadness or fear or anger. Doesn't mean to push them down, because actually it creates other problems. And we are going to go into that. And just as a final thought before we go into the next episode is that I love how all of these obstacles, so-called obstacles, these are simply manifestations of the second state. These are manifestations of what happens when consciousness is in this waking sleep, when consciousness is unaware of itself. Then what happens is one of these things. So I love how Ouspensky, they were like, hey, All right, so equip yourself with a little more attention, a little self-observation, and let's start observing these things every day. Observe this tendency to check out in daydreaming, observe this taking personally, getting identified, observing these things. So, and each time you observe it, you kind of, at the beginning, you cannot stop it. Sometimes you observe it and then it continues. As you get stronger, you observe it and then it diminishes for a little bit. So also all of these obstacles, they create suffering. Actually, there's suffering in each one of them, either more obvious suffering or hidden, buried suffering. And yeah, so stay tuned, and we are going to go into each one of them separately.
I also wanted to add that, we had a segment on essence and personality earlier, and Gurdjieff pointed out that all the obstacles to self-remembering are in personality. So these things we've been describing are really when they manifest, when they take full form, they become a manifestation of our false personality. It's because it's an imaginary picture of ourselves we're using to cover over our natural, simple selves. It's these masks, and they're unnecessary. That's the other thing about the fourth way explains. All of these obstacles, we don't have to live our life with any of these things. This is very exciting, very promising, and not as easy as it sounds.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good.